In this presentation, we're going to cover the public sector union debate, and we're going to cover really the viewpoints of a couple of different authors based on their writings about unions in general and then public employee unions. So the content of this presentation comes from a chapter in Michael D. Yates' book, Why Unions Matter, the chapter just called Why Unions, where he makes the argument for why unions are really a good thing, the positive things about unions, and why they're needed. And the other part of this presentation comes from a chapter from Daniel DiSalvo's book, Government Against Itself, Public Union Power and Its Consequences. This book covers the negative consequences of public employee unions. So the goal here is to look at a couple of different arguments, and it's really up to you as the reader and as the watcher of this presentation to kind of decide which arguments you find more compelling. So we'll start with the Yates, the Yates book on why unions. So Yates starts his argument by saying, our employers organize workplaces so we are unable to have control over our own actions. So if you think about anything about the employer-employee relationship, management gives the direction, employees really have to do what management says, which is a dynamic that we see in bureaucracy, in public administration, where you have, a hierarchy, right? And so really, workplaces are inherently organized so that workers are unable to control their own actions. They're there to do a job and the things that they're told. We all have to work, but our jobs are tenuous. What does that mean? Well, most jobs, especially outside the public sector, and Yates is talking about all unions, like private and public sector. Most jobs, especially outside the public sector, are tenuous. As in, you can be terminated pretty quickly for any legal reasons. So most workers are at-will employees. At-will employees, the employer can dismiss an employee for any legal reason, right? You still can't be fired for illegal reasons. But you can be fired for any reason that isn't illegal. They don't need a reason. They don't need cause to get rid of. So you don't have to have done something wrong, and usually you don't need to have a bunch of notice or anything like that. The flip side of that is, of course, employees can break off their relationship with employers too. But this makes this pretty tenuous. Management can decide one day, and this has happened to people we've known. It probably has happened to people that you know. It's certainly happened to people that I know, where you're called into a meeting, you're not told what the meeting's about, and then you and your coworkers are told today's your last day. So Yates says, with the way that that workplaces are organized, and with the tenuous nature of employment, this becomes, this environment that he argues why you need unions. The other reason is we're replaceable. A lot of us like to think that we're not replaceable, but we are. As workers, you might be a great worker. You might be someone that people will, when you leave, will wish you had stayed, or maybe you're harder to replace than some other people. But ultimately, we're all replaceable, and that shifts. These three things shift the power dynamic toward the employers. So Yates turns to a strength in numbers argument. Workers figure out that if they stick together, they can change things. So by working together, uh, workers can make some change in the workplace collectively, because there are more workers than there are managers. Labor unions are like any other voluntary organization in a lot of ways. They're not any different from a lot of other uh, organizations that people volunteer to be a part of. The difference between labor unions and other organizations is that labor unions are formed in response to the daily grind of working for others. So, whereas other voluntary organizations might have political causes, they might be fighting for certain policies, they might be, working to help the environment or change tax policy or whatever. Um, the difference really becomes labor unions are about the daily grind of working for others. So labor unions are focused on your pay, your benefits, your working conditions, disciplinary processes, negotiating things that have to do with the workplace. And Yates then turns to whether unions work or not. Employers fight really hard against unionization because unions are good for workers. This is Yates' argument. If they weren't really good for workers, then employers would not fight against them so hard. And there's a lot of research, and even the people who make arguments against public employee labor unions will recognize some of these things. There's a union advantage. There's better wages, better insurance, better pensions, better overall compensation in unionized workplaces. There's also some spillover effects. Where unions are strong, non-union employers pay higher wages and better benefits. So the spillover effect here is, say you have a state with a lot of strong teachers unions. Even the teachers that are in non-unionized workplaces, private schools or maybe charter schools, um, those teachers get paid more than teachers in states that don't have a lot of unionized teachers. So there's a spillover effect. The upward push of the wages helps even those in the profession who are not in a union, uh, because of this, having to compete with the unionized places, and paying a higher wage. And so the spillover effect, Yates argues, is why unions are good even for the people who aren't in unions. Unions offer protection from at-will employment. So the contract will have negotiated, a collective bargaining agreement will have negotiated a process for terminating an employee. And it's not that it's impossible to terminate an employee, but it is more likely that they need to have cause, that there's some kind of disciplinary process before an employee can be let go. And so collectively bargaining an agreement with management can help protect workers from at-will employment. Is less likely that you're going to be told one day, goodbye. It gives a voice to workers by putting them on more equal footing than management. And Yates doesn't say equal footing, he says more equal footing, because ultimately management does have management rights. There's certain things in the workplace that are not negotiable because they have to stay within the power of management. I give you an example from academia. A management right is the course schedule. The chair of department's administration, if they say X course needs taught and you're going to teach it, that is not something that a union can negotiate. Same thing with like class sizes in higher ed, at least. I think K through 12 they might negotiate some class maximums, but class sizes are not negotiable in higher ed, at least in Ohio. So there are certain things that are management rights. So a union doesn't put you on equal footing with management. Management ultimately has decisions they have to make. They control budgets. They control certain decisions, but it does give the workers more ability to protect themselves from at-will employment, negotiate certain processes, and these procedures include grievance procedures, mediation, arbitration. So if you have conflict in the workplace, you have processes that are negotiated where either side can file a grievance. Then representatives from both sides can work out this conflict, and you can follow this process for resolving whether somebody thinks they've been treated unfairly or someone's not following the contract on either side. And if things get to a point of stalemate, then you have mediation and arbitration, which we don't need to get into a lot of detail about, but mediation, you bring in a mediator and they try to resolve the conflict, but both sides have to come to an agreement on their own with a mediator. So it's a little softer, it's not binding. With arbitration, you bring in a third party. The two sides plead their case, about what they think is right, and then a lot of times there will be binding arbitration where the arbitrator will either pick one side that to enforce that part of the contract, or they will split the difference and come to some ground in the middle. Depending on the state, depending on procedures and laws in the state as to how that works. But really, collective bargaining agreements, they're negotiated by management and labor. So they tie both sides with the expectations in them, and both sides have to follow the contract. And it is a give and take. Neither side gets everything they want, and so when you have issues with implementing the contract, you have these agreed upon procedures to resolve conflict, not create conflict. That's the grievance procedures, mediation, arbitration. Now, let's switch over to the DiSalvo argument. His is specific to government employees. So some of his argument is not necessarily that unions are ineffective or bad, but they're a different animal in the public sector than they are the private sector. So here are his arguments. Government is a unique employer that is not easily compared to other employers. So often government has kind of not technically a monopoly, but they have no other competition. You do have some private companies that offer like EMS services, emergency medical services, or maybe private security services. But basically, your local fire department and EMTs don't have competition in the area. Same with your local police department. Your public schools might have some competition with private schools. But a lot of government services are just government services. They're the essential services that a community needs, especially we're talking at the local level. And there really is no competition. The goals of government employers are not as clear as the private sector. So the goals of government is not there's a need to run things efficiently, but efficiency isn't always easy to measure, and it's not always easy to figure out what is success in the public sector. So in the private sector, you can decide how many cars are coming off the line, right? How many, if we're auto workers, how many Ford F-150s are being made and how many are being sold, and profit is pretty easy to figure out. But when you don't produce anything, when you're providing services, it's harder to decide what success is, what the goals are. Measuring outcomes are just not as easy as in the private sector. So, you know, deciding who is a good teacher, there are some indicators for that, but there's also a lot of other confounding factors. You wouldn't want us to judge police officers. You know, you're a better police officer if you give more speeding tickets. That's not really necessarily a measure of a better police officer, just like you wouldn't judge a fire department by how many fires there are, or how many fires they put out, because you want fewer fires, just like you want fewer car accidents, just like teachers face different circumstances depending on the districts and the students and the communities that they're teaching in. So the measuring success isn't quite as easy. DiSalvo presents an argument with 4 themes that highlight the differences between public sector and private sector unions. The first theme is democracy. In collective negotiations with government, elected representatives partly cede control of the bureaucracy to unelected labor leaders. So he makes the argument that when a government entity is negotiating with the workers, they're ceding control and they're being less democratic by giving unelected labor leaders power. So the people who negotiate the contracts are not elected on the labor side. They're not elected on the management side oftentimes either. But the ones that are negotiating are appointed or hired by an elected board. So, for example, when the teachers negotiate, none of the teachers are elected. They are public employees meant to carry out the will of the people in the education realm. They negotiate with the superintendent and the management side when it comes to creating a labor contract. But the superintendent was hired by the school board, and the school board is elected. So the idea here is you're really negotiating with the school board, which has to vote for the agreement, and the school board is giving unelected people power to run the public schools when they negotiate with labor leaders. Policy choices then, because of this, become an outcome of negotiations between office holders and unions rather than an expression of the public will channeled through their representatives. And unions can distort democracy by raising funds and mobilizing for candidates that will be more favorable to them in negotiations. So they can lobby, or they can help elect people in their local communities that will then be more favorable to them. The next theme is equity. So workers in the public sector have better benefits and retirement than their counterparts. Again, this comes back to what I mentioned earlier with Yates, in that even people who are making the argument against public employee unions concede that there are better benefits in retirement, and in some professions at least, better wages, though not all. Sometimes the private sector pays better in some areas than the public sector. But workers, he says, have in the public sector have better benefits and better retirement than their counterparts. Public resources allow this divide to create pension envy. Bringing the quality of private sector benefits and retirement up is not realistic. I suppose it depends on what private sector employers we're talking about. Some employers probably could provide better benefits and retirement than they do. He says that a lot of them can't actually do that. So this creates pension envy. Unions in the private sector help decrease inequalities by benefiting poor and less educated workers, but public sector unions often organize more highly educated professional workers. So his argument here is, in the private sector, unions actually help like working class, professions with lower education, and that brings people up. that pushes wages up and makes it so that these poorer and less educated sectors can make a good living. but in so you're thinking about like auto workers, union pipe fitters, construction workers, things like that. when you're thinking about the in the private sector, which workers are being pushed up by the work of the unions. But in the public sector, they often organize more highly educated workers, so more professional workers who have like a wage premium already. So if you're thinking about like more highly educated teachers and other professions, so it's not creating the same benefit for society of bringing up the poorer and less educated, according to DiSalvo. Efficiency. So public employees drive up the cost of government, and most of that cost goes to employee salaries and benefits. Of course, most of that cost goes to employee salary and benefits because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't produce anything. We're not making T-shirts and shoes, and we're not producing cars off the line. We're providing services, police, fire, education, garbage collection, your health inspectors, making sure that food is safe in your local restaurants and things like that. Those are services. So, of course, most of that cost goes to employee salaries and benefits. And when public employee unions drive up the cost of government, they make it less efficient. So he mentions that there's a correlation between debt and public sector union strength. So governments have higher debt ratios where there are more public sector unions. Public sector unions make it more difficult to fire workers. So what Yates says is a positive thing and why unions matter, DiSalvo is saying is actually a negative thing. Because you have seniority rules where the last one in, first one out. So if you don't, when layoffs come, when retrenchment happens, workers who are younger and less experienced get terminated first, and these processes arguably protect quote unquote bad workers. Purpose. Rather than focus on resources and services, like government should be, DiSalvo says government funding is tied up in union contracts, and this being tied up in union contracts and not focusing on improving services ends up resulting in cuts being proposed to education, police, and fire, and other social services. So we lose the sense of purpose in what our government is supposed to be doing, which is providing effective services efficiently. And so those are the two arguments presented here today, one by Michael D. Yates and Why Unions Matter, and the other by Daniel DiSalvo and Government Against Itself. Kind of two sides of the same coin, the positives and negatives of unions, and coupled with other things that you read and other arguments that are out there, it is up to the reader and the watcher to decide which ones of these arguments are more convincing, and what the possible. Neither of these authors cover everything perfectly, so there are, of course, criticisms of any of these arguments. Thanks.